I've decided to do my topic on feminist methodology in biblical interpretation, along with the compare and contrast of two feminist theologians. The first being Elizabeth Johnson, who is the author of She Who Is, and the second being Dolores Williams, who is the author of Sisters in the Wilderness. So both of these well-written pieces of feminist theological interpretation agree that there is a need for feminist theology within biblical understanding, but they differ in the points of view of why it's needed, what needs to be done, and how it needs to be done. So Elizabeth Johnson argued that feminist theology, much like Black theology, should encounter and encompass a form of liberation theology, including the way we not only view God, but the way we speak about God and how this affects how we see the rest of the world. Dolores Williams, on the other hand, argues that throughout the Bible we can see acts of oppression where God remains silent, ultimately stating that God's liberation is narrowed to only a specific amount of people. So just a background, three major types of feminist theological interpretation include revolutionary feminist theology, which is the idea that religion in itself is so oppressive that it needs to be forgotten altogether. This is also seen as radical feminist theology. The second is reformist Christian feminist theology, which is the idea that there is absolutely nothing oppressive within the Bible, and that the oppressive nature of religion is the way that the Bible is being interpreted by certain theologians. And then the last is known as Reconstructionist Christian feminist theology, which is basically the middle of the spectrum, saying that, so basically they believe that the Bible has some oppressive nature to it, but because the Bible is mainly about liberation at its core, the liberation involved with the oppression of women is what's being focused. These are known as academic feminist theologians. So Elizabeth Johnson states that relating to a normative male gender makes connections to God almost exclusively from a patriarchal society and makes it seem like women are not created in the image of God. She states that this is idolatrous because it makes it seem like male-only theology is the only way to talk about God, meaning that if God is male, then male is God. So in her analysis of sexism, she states that religious patriarchy is one of the strongest forms of patriarchy and of oppressive nature because it understands itself to be divinely established. So the goal of feminist theology to Johnson would be to basically transform the entire system into a new community or liberation. So she believes that talking about God as a man not only fails human beings, but also fails the divine mystery within the Bible. So the way it fails human beings is that it justifies dominance of men while deteriorating the human dignity of women. But it also fails divine mystery by reducing the mystery to a single metaphor that man is ruling and therefore loses its ability to point to ultimate truth because it's saying that God is one thing only. She says that this form of thinking also has both sociological and psychological negative effects on the rest of the world and people who identify as Christian. So the sociological negative aspect is that it functions as a tool for symbolic violence against self-identity of females. Or that's the psychological. And the sociological is that it reinforces the rule of the father, male leaders, and man is basically given a sacred backing. So in the psychological effects, women get the idea that they're not created in the image of God because God is seen as man instead of doesn't have a gender. Dolores Williams supports the idea that faith has served as a support system emotionally, psychologically, spiritually during exploitation of a certain group of people, especially among those in the Black community. She states that Black liberation theology and feminist theology are kind of the same understanding and theological method, but certain areas, or they're the same in understanding the theological methodology, certain areas of Christian doctrine and of ethics. So she uses the story of Hagar and Sarah in the Bible to show that the oppressed and abused do not always experience God's liberating power because God didn't liberate Hagar. And she states that one can wonder how biblically derived messages of liberation can be taken seriously by today's masses of poor, homeless African Americans, female and male, who consider themselves to be experiencing a form of slavery, because if not all are being liberated, then what's the point? It shouldn't be taken seriously. So she highlights the community of people who are being oppressed by the oppressed, and this is another thing that she states that liberation theologians don't look at. So Black women, for example, would be considered the oppressed by the oppressed. So it seems here to me that Williams continues to make arguments about God being unjust and a supporter of oppressive power, but then also goes on to give examples about how merciful God has been to some of the oppressed. So I can understand where her problem would be that because it was only some people who were being liberated, liberation in itself is oppressive to those who were not, who weren't liberated within the text. I have the last note that I have on her is a quote from her book that she says, "Liberation is an ultimate, but in the meantime, survival and prosperity must be the experience of the people." So this basically means that some are more concerned with liberation biblical interpretation, while others are more concerned with the survival quality of life in the biblical interpretation. And she's stating that these two need to work together in understanding the biblical text.